We were discussing the organization or the framework of somatic sensory system. We had just concluded the topic of receptors, how the receptors pick up the stimulus and how they transduce them into electrical signals. So, from the receptors, they have to next move to the central nervous system via the first order neuron. And where these first order neurons are located, it differs again. So some of this somatic sensory system senses such as your pain, touch and temperature have their nuclei or the body of the first order neuron at the level of spinal cord. But some of the sensations like the fine touch, the diagnosis, 2-point discrimination or the higher level or the newly evolved senses have their nuclei or the first order neuron located higher up in medulla, which we will discuss later. So it is kind of clear that the first order nucleus or the neuron is either located in the spinal cord or the brainstem. So that's why I had actually put up this beautiful diagram of the spinal cord, which should probably clear all our doubts regarding the spinal cord. So basically, anatomically, let's discuss the spinal cord in detail, so that in questions when they display the spinal cord picture, we have to be oriented, right? You have to not confuse between the anterior, posterior, medial and lateral. So how to distinguish first of all between the anterior and posterior? It's a simple kind of funda happening around here. So anteriorly what we have is a fissure, but posteriorly we have a small sulcus. You can see a small sulcus and a septum, and this is your central canal, as we all know. So basically anteriorly we have a deeper sulcus or a fissure they call it. Posteriorly it is just a shallow sulcus and it is continued as the posterior median septum or the posterior median septum is the how it is called. So what supplies the spinal cord? Any guesses? If you say the anterior 2/3 are supplied by the anterior spinal artery and the posterior 1/3 are supplied by posterior spinal artery, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So where does the anterior spinal artery run? They run somewhere here, but it is supplied by a single anterior spinal artery running along the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. But where do the posterior spinal artery run and how many they are? The posterior spinal artery are 2 in number and they run on the posterior intermediate septum, somewhere like this. As you would all know, the neurons or the neuron matter or the nervous content of the central nervous system is usually divided or organized into a gray matter and a white matter. This is the pink area in this diagram is nothing but your white matter and the gray one is your gray matter. So I'm using gray for gray. I hope you can see it. Gray for gray and white. I'll shade this area as white. So this is a gray matter and the inside one, which is like a butterfly, beautiful butterfly, is your gray matter. Okay, how for this gray matter organized? It is pretty simple. I said wherever the anterior median fissure, it is the anterior side of the spinal cord. What is adjacent to it is nothing but your anterior horn or called the ventral horn, and whichever is posterior is your dorsal horn or the posterior horn. Why is it called the anterior? Why is it called ventral? Why it is called dorsal and not posterior? In some places, some textbooks give different names. Basically, the dorsal and ventral terms is applicable for four-legged animals. So whichever is on the upper side of the four-legged animal is dorsal and whichever is on the downside is called the ventral. In a human being, you can just think of a human being in a four-leg position, or the knees onto the ground with knees onto the ground. So how do we look like? The anterior comes onto the front or the ventral, and the dorsal, which is the posterior aspect of your spinal cord, is facing upwards, which is the dorsal aspect. So this ventral and dorsal term is applicable mostly for the four-legged animals. Even many neurologists have confusion why it is ventral dorsal, why shouldn't we using it, calling it anterior posterior. So it is framed in that way. It is applicable for four-legged animal. Anterior posterior is for human anatomy. Okay. So you can very well see the anterior horn, you can proudly call it the anterior horn, and you can see the posterior horn. And between them is a gray area, which is your intermediate horn. So what is the function of dorsal horn or the posterior horn? What is the function of anterior horn, and what is the function of intermediate horn? So gray matter usually carry the cell bodies, the neuronal bodies, whereas the white matter carry the neuronal axons, the fibers, and the fibers form different tracks which have different names, and some of the tracks run upward, some of the tracks run downward, so which will be studying detail when we discuss the ascending and descending tracks. So basically you have to know that the gray matter consists of the cell bodies and the white matter consists of the cell axons, the neuronal axons. So which cell bodies are located in the dorsal horn? The cell bodies located in the dorsal horn are mainly for carrying out the integration of afferent pathway, whereas the cell bodies located in the anterior horn are mainly for the integration of the efferent pathway or the motor pathway. So what does the one which is in the middle, the intermediate horn, do? The cell bodies in the intermediate horn are for the autonomic functions. I hope it is clear. I mean, how the functionally the dorsal, ventral and the intermediate horns are organized into. So extending from the dorsal horn, you can see a nerve emerging or a root emerging. It is called the posterior radical or the dorsal root. Whereas you can also see in the anterior aspect you have an anterior root of the spinal nerve. So okay, since we are discussing the somatic sensations, I would like to go more about the dorsal root. So okay, why did I show you the dorsal horn, ventral horn and all that? It is for this particular reason. So the dorsal root gives rise to a nerve radical. Radical is nothing but a root. So the root has a small swelling called the dorsal root ganglion. Since it is arising from the posterior root, it is called the dorsal root ganglion or the posterior root ganglion, whatever you want. Why it is a small swelling? What is inside which makes it swell? So the small swelling is nothing but due to the presence of a cell or the cell body. The cell body of what? The cell body of the first order neuron of somatic sensory pathway. I hope you all are pretty clear what is running in there. I mean the somatic sensory pathway. You can clearly see a cell body lying in there and with two axons, which is more or less simulating a unipolar cells without any kind of dendrites, and it is called a pseudo unipolar neuron. So the sensory ganglion carries pseudo unipolar neurons. Okay, well, where does the axon end? One end of the axon ends in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, as you can all see here. Where does the other root run? I mean, where does the other axon run? It runs to the periphery, where it ends in closer vicinity to a sensory receptor, or itself get modified into a sensory receptor. So basically, the information from the receptors are carried by the first order neuron into the spinal cord. So what happens when the information from the first order neuron enters the spinal cord? Basically, the axon which enters the spinal cord, just a sec, The axon which enters the spinal cord can divide into two. One branch which will end in the substance of the dorsal horn, and the other branch which ends in the white matter. And these two form different tracks respectively. What are the tracks they form? There's the branch which ends directly into the white matter of the spinal cord becomes the dorsal column, because as you can see, it ends up into the posterior white matter, the white matter existing between the two dorsal horns of the spinal cord. So it becomes the dorsal tract, and the end one which ends up into the substance of the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord synapses with a neuron there, and this new neuron gives rise to an axon which will cross over to the opposite side and run as the anterolateral tract. I hope it is all clear how the dorsal tract emerges and the anterolateral tract emerges from the dorsal root ganglion cell body. So as you can see clearly here, the dorsal tract is not crossed yet. I mean, the ipsilateral fiber is carried along the same direction. I mean, let us consider this to be the left side of the body. So the fibers from the left side of the body runs in the left dorsal tract, whereas the fiber from the left side of the body crosses in front of the central canal of the spinal cord and runs as the right sided anterolateral tract. Why the division? I mean, dorsal tract, anterolateral tract. As you all see, or as you all learned before, the nerve impulses is same. I mean, it's just the action potential. How can you differentiate between a touch, a pain, a fine touch, a crude touch, a temperature? It all is down to this. I mean, if it is running in the dorsal tract and is ending up in a nucleus specific to the dorsal tract, it is assumed, it is perceived by the central nervous system that it is a sensation coming from a specialized receptor or a more well developed receptor. It is also called the neothalamic spinothalamic pathway, the dorsal tract, whereas the anterolateral tract is called the paleospinal thalamic tract because it carries sensations which are more of an older sensation, such as your crude touch, pain, temperature, and so on. So which is existing for a very long time in the course of evolution, whereas the fine touch, stereognosis, 2-point discrimination, and so vibration and so on are carried in the dorsal tract of the spinal tract, which is the dorsal tract of the spinal cord. I hope it is all clear. But which kind of neuron, now axon, actually carries the sensation from the receptor to the first order neuron? I mean, we all know that by Erlanger classification, the nerve fibers are classified into different types like A alpha, A beta, A gamma, delta fibers and beta fibers, and delta fibers, gamma fibers, and so on. Whereas for sensory system, we have a different kind of classification as well, 1A, 1B, and so on. So let's look into that. What kind of sensations carry, I mean, what kind of nerve fibers carry sensations from the receptors to the first order neuron? It's a beautiful image we have. You can kindly make a note of it, and it is taken from a reference www.mediconotebook.com, and basically what we have here is a numerical the classification of nerve fibers into two types based on the Erlanger classification and the numerical classification. The numerical classification is applicable only for sensory system, whereas the Erlanger classification is applicable to both the sensory and as well as motor system and even the autonomic nervous system, as we all know. So what happens here is basically as according to the Erlanger classification, the fibers are divided into A alpha, A beta, A gamma, A delta, B and C type of fibers. Whereas according to the numerical classification, we have just 5: 1A, 1B, 2, 3 and 4. I hope it's clear to everyone right now. What is the difference between these nerve fibers? They are classified into this many types. It is nothing but the speed of conduction. So the fastest conduction occurs in A alpha fibers and the slowest conduction happens in C type of fibers. On the other hand, the fastest type of conduction occurs in 1A, the slowest kind of conduction happens in 4. So what is responsible for the faster and slower conduction? There are a multitude of factors. The most important of them is their diameter of the cross section of each nerve fiber, which is the highest in 1A and lowest in 4. And the other factor is the myelination. The myelinated fibers like the 1A, 1B, 2 and 3 have quite a faster conduction as opposed to the unmyelinated fibers of type 4. And in the Erlanger classification, type C are unmyelinated while type A and type B are myelinated. So what is important to note here is the fact that the sensations we were talking about all the time, like the touch and pressure, or A beta fibers, and at the same time under the numerical classification they belong to type 2. The pain sensation is actually classified into two types: the fast pain or an acute pain and a slow pain or a chronic pain. So as you know from the name, the faster pain has to be traveling in a faster nerve fiber, which between the two is but the pain, as I said you before, is this older sensation, so it can be taken to the central nervous system slower than the faster sensations such as your fine touch, your pressure, your proprioception, your vibration and so on. So what comes between the A beta fiber and the C fiber is your A delta fibers, where your fast pain and crude touch and cold sensations run. So this is it. And what happens to the slower pain, the warm sensations and other receptors, other senses like crude touch and so on? They are carried by your C type of fibers, which is nothing but your type 4 and numerical system. And proprioception is the fastest traveling sensation, thanks to the sensation being taken off by the A alpha kind of fiber in the Erlanger classification, and in the numerical classification they fall under 1A and 1B. And as you all know, the end organs of proprioception are two, mainly the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ. The muscle spindle, the fibers originating from the muscle spindles are of A type, and the fibers originating from the Golgi tendon organ are of the 1B type. But both of them are A alpha type under Erlanger classification. So basically in somatic system we have to take care of the A alpha type, the A beta type, A delta type and C type. So A alpha is for proprioception, A delta is for the touch, and A beta is for the touch, pressures, vibrations, stereognosis and so on. A delta is for the faster pain and cold and itch, tickle and some of the primitive sensations, even the sexual functions are even transmitted by A delta type of fiber. And the C fibers, which are the slowest of them all, carry the slow pain, heart and other of the primitive sensations, as I told you before. And as you can see here, under the numerical classification you have 1A, 1B, 2 and 4, which are important to us, as well as 3. Because as I said to you before, the numerical classification is applicable only to the sensory. So the fastest of them all come as 1, The next fastest come as 2, which is nothing but your touch and the vibratory sensation, some of the newer sensations. What comes between the faster sensation and the slowest sensation? That the slowest sensation, as I told you before, the slow pain is nothing but your fast pain, so it comes as 3, and the slowest of them all is 4. I hope the type of nerve fibers and the sensations they carry is quite clear for you. With that, we'll move on to our next topic, which is nothing but the tracts in the spinal cord. As you can see here, the spinal cord, as I told you before, the dorsal, I'll use a diagram, the dorsal nerve root, and you have a swelling. The swelling gives rise to 2 type of fibers, which one will run here, cross to the opposite side, and here, or rather I would choose to draw it on the opposite side so that it will be easier for correlation. And dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so what happens here is basically one of the branch runs in the dorsal tract, goes upwards, one comes to the front. It can end up as a lateral tract or as an anterior tract, which is nothing but your anterolateral tract, and run upwards as the anterolateral spinothalamic tract. So what are the sensations carried by the dorsal column? It is a deep touch, proprioception and vibration, as I told you before. And what is carried out in the ventrolateral spinothalamic tract is pain, temperature and light touch. I hope it's clear the sensations carried by the different tracts, that is the dorsal tract and the ventrolateral spinothalamic tract. Now, what advance you have to learn? As we learn a concept, we have to go to the next level. So what is the next concept you are going to learn is how the fibers are organized. How the fibers in the dorsal tract are organized. It will be clear right now. I hope you can see a letter S, you can see a letter T, L, you can see the letter thoracic, and you can see a letter C. So what does this exactly mean? So S for sacral, L for lumbar, TH for thoracic and C for cervical. So clearly from this diagram we can understand that the sensations from the lower part of the body run medially in the dorsal tract, and the same is not applicable actually to the anterolateral spinothalamic tract. So basically the sensations from the lower part of the body run medially in the dorsal spinothalamic tract, whereas the sensations from the upper part of the body run laterally in the dorsal spinothalamic tract. The opposite order is followed in the anterolateral spinothalamic tract. So why this is important is the sensations from the lower part of the body are running as fasciculus gracilis, FG I would call it, in the medulla, or even in the dorsal tract we can classify them into fasciculus gracilis, and the tracts which arise from the upper part of the body, they run laterally and they are called fasciculus cuneatus. And you should all know the opposite order is followed in the lateral or the anterolateral spinothalamic tract. Okay, so we have discussed about the receptor, we have discussed about the first order neuron, and we have to discuss the secondary synapse, or the second order neuron basically. We saw for the nerve fibers running in the anterolateral spinothalamic tract, the second order neuron is located at the level of the nerve root itself. I will go back to that. As you can see here, as soon as the first order neuron gives rise to an axon which divides into two branches, one of them runs dorsally and one of them ends in the substance of the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and that's where the second order neuron for the sensations running in the anterolateral spinothalamic tracts run. Whereas for the dorsal tract sensations, the second order neuron is located higher up. They are located in the medulla oblongata. So this is a section of medulla oblongata taken at the level of sensory decussation. You can clearly see there is a fasciculus gracilis and there is a fasciculus cuneatus here. So what does the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus mean? Basically, we saw it before. Fasciculus gracilis carry the sensations from the lower part of the body, and the fasciculus cuneatus carry the sensations from the upper part of the body. So they run and end in the nucleus of gracilis and the nucleus of cuneatus respectively at the level of sensory decussation. And you can very well see two swellings here. Two swellings in the medulla. These two swellings will project into the roof of the fourth ventricle clearly as cuneate and gracil cuneatus and gracil complexes on the fourth ventricle, roof of the fourth ventricle. From the gracilis and cuneate nucleus, the second order neuron gives rise to axon which run to the opposite side. Okay, I'll use a different color. From the gracilis and the cuneate nucleus, they run to the opposite side and form what is known as the medial lemniscus. And where does the anterolateral spinal thalamic tract here? It is somewhere here. It is called the spinal lemniscus in the white matter of medulla. So the anterolateral spinothalamic tract, they run a spinal lemniscus in the brainstem, whereas the fibers from the dorsal tract end up in the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus at the level of sensory decussation, form the nerve fibers or tracts which run to the opposite side, and that is why you call it as the sensory decussation. The nerve fibers cross over and form a medial lemniscus on the opposite side. So basically all kinds of sensations, let us assume the sensations have originated from the left hand side of the person, have now come to the right side of the brainstem. I hope it's clear. Both the sensations have crossed over, and from here they'll all go to a third order neuron. Where is the third order neuron located? So this is the spinal lemniscus and this is your medial lemniscus, and between them we have different types of lemniscus like the trigeminal lemniscus and also the lateral lemniscus. So lateral lemniscus will carry the auditory signals, whereas the trigeminal lemniscus will carry sensations from the trigeminal nerve, spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, which is located lower down in the medulla, which we'll discuss later. From there, the sensations, the medial lemniscus and also the spinal lemniscus end in a structure called as the thalamus. I hope you can all appreciate this is the transverse section of brain, and you can very well see two lateral ventricles here. I mean the two horns of the lateral ventricles, and you can see a structure here which is the third ventricle, and two structures which is located on the lateral aspect of the third ventricle in very close proximity. This is your thalamus, and between the two thalami and also in the third ventricle and the interthalamic adhesions. I hope it's pretty clear. You can pick up the thalamus in the transverse section of brain. So this is thalamus in a 3D view. You can very well see the thalamic gray matter and white matter is divided by the white matter, forming what is called the lamina. It divides the thalamus into an anterior part, the lateral or the dorsal part, and the medial part, which is with a median aspect having an interthalamic adhesion, which will communicate to the opposite side. So the dorsal or posterior part is further divided into many nuclei by the lines formed by the white matter of thalamus, which we are not concerned with very deeply. All we have to know is that the medial lemniscus carrying the sensations of the dorsal tract, and the anterolateral spinothalamic tract carrying the sensations whose sensations are carried by the spinal lemniscus, and both of them end in the ventro-posterior medial of nucleus of the thalamus. So this is what we have to know. This is where the third order neuron of the sensory pathway or the somatic sensory pathway is located, and from there also you will all know the sensations end up in the cortex. Where in cortex? Any guesses? If you say they end up in Brodmann area 3, 1 and 2, you are absolutely right. Absolutely right. And this is called the primary sensory area, and which is located in the postcentral gyrus. Why is it called the postcentral gyrus? The one line which I am drawing in red is the central fissure, and the gyrus which is located posterior to the central fissure is a postcentral gyrus, and the postcentral gyrus consists of Brodmann area 312, and this is your primary sensory area. So the sensations of the left side, be it any sensation, pain, touch, temperature, fine touch, crude touch, stereognosis, 2-point discrimination, vibration, all end up on the contralateral side, which is the right side in this case. So they end up in the Brodmann area 312, which is located on the postcentral gyrus of the parietal cortex, which is nothing but your primary sensory area. So the primary sensory area is again different areas of the body are represented on the primary sensory area as follows, which is called the sensory homunculus, and as you can see here, certain structures are represented very large, such as the fingers. The tongue has a separate area itself, the lips has a separate area, this is what we have to know. The fingers, the lips, the face, the tongue have very broad areas, whereas the shoulder, trunk, hip, knee, the toes again have very large area, but the shoulder, hip, trunk, knee have a very, very small area. Okay, and your genitals usually are represented somewhere around here. Then they do have a very big representation as well. As you can see here, the intra-abdominal structures, the pharynx are also located, also have a very large representation in the parietal cortex, that is the Brodmann area 312. Why do certain structures have to have a very large representation? Again, it's based on the use and disuse theory. The sensations from the face and tongue and the pharynx, the intra-abdominal sensations carry a lot of meaning. I mean, the sensations from the pharynx, sensations from the mouth, sensations from the lip. Why are they important? Because they are important for the salivary sensations, for the salivary reflex, for the deglutition reflex, and intra-abdominal sensations for the peristalsis, integration of peristalsis. Why is important? The hands and toes are represented large. The toes have to feel the ground, and only then we have a sense of position, and with that we can integrate our body balance. Why our hands are represented very large? We use our hands to feel objects, to feel the texture of the objects, to feel the contours of the object, and that is what you call stereognosis, 2-point discrimination, fine touch, crude touch, heat, temperature. And we use our hand to feel objects, and that's why our hands are represented very large. So this is why certain structures are represented very large in the cortex, and certain structures are represented small in the cortex. And as you can see here, tongue is located near the fold of a cortex, and this fold of the cortex, if you would remember, is called the insular cortex. And insular cortex is where the taste sensations or the gustatory sensations end up. So as you can see here, the somatic sensation from the tongue and the hidden sensation, the taste sensations, end in very, very close proximity, and that is why tongue ends here and not somewhere here. I hope sensory homunculus, if it is clear, I think we can actually move on to the last topic of the day. And before moving on to the last topic of the day, I think we can have a look at the functions of the 5 and 7. They are also called as supplementary sensory areas or secondary sensory areas. Different books give different names. In fact, they are further subdivided into different names. I don't want to confuse you all with that. It is just used for analyzing whatever is perceived by the primary sensory area. The analysis and comparison with the past memory is responsible for further refining the responses of a human to a sensory stimulus. And that's all. But before that, I'd like to go back to this picture. Okay, well, we don't have a picture of what I was trying to say. So, okay, what I was trying to discuss was about the, oh boy,